Near the end of the summer of 2016, I began hormone replacement therapy to better align my body with my identity as a girl. I had been through a lot in the year before, but after starting hormones, things got better way quickly. I became way happier, my grades improved, and I even got better at Smash coincidentally. I had built up experience over a year competing, and I got through my mental issues with the help of transitioning, and so I became an honorable mention in my first season back, and soon after I became power ranked. Quickly after this, I moved to Michigan for school and entered their Smash scene. In Michigan, tournaments were way bigger than in my home region of Pittsburgh. At first, I did pretty well. I almost took sets off PR players and my placings were pretty solid overall. However, my performance quickly declined over the year and my mentality went with it. There were probably a lot of reasons for this, but I started to doubt whether or not my gender was an issue. Did me transitioning somehow impair my ability to play Smash competitively? For those of you that know me, this might sound very weird. I identify as a feminist and I'm very frequent to point out when women are mistreated or misrepresented. So why would I stereotype myself in this way? This mentality almost made me quit at one point as I was enjoying the game less and less and felt terrible every time I lost, even in friendlies. As it turns out, there are gender related reasons for why I was underperforming, but those reasons have nothing to do with a female brain or new hormones or anything. The reasoning is stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is when marginalized groups underperform to their own standards because of stereotypes about them. This was discovered in 1995 in a psychology paper that found that black students performed worse on a test when they were told it was diagnostic of intellectual ability as compared to students who were not told this at all. The reasoning is that there are negative stereotypes surrounding African Americans and their intelligence. So when they were told it was a test of intellectual ability, they not only had to contend with the test in front of them, but they also had to contend with the negative stereotypes about their group while taking this test. Stereotype threat has been found in almost every population you can think of, including majority groups, and in situations where there's no negative stereotype, people are just led to believe there is one. There's also been a ton of research into under what conditions people are affected, the mechanisms that underlie this psychological phenomenon, and ways we can all deal with it. Using this research, I'm going to examine women's experience of threat in the Smash community. I'm not going to examine other marginalized identities simply because I don't have that experience and it's not my place to say. First, I'm going to prove to you that stereotype threat almost definitely plays a role in Smash tournaments, that these effects are meaningful, that the stereotypes themselves aren't even accurate, and lastly, I'm going to look at ways for us all to move forward to better our community and ourselves. So what evidence is there that women are affected in Smash tournaments by stereotype threat? It's not like there's research examining Smash tournaments specifically. That being said, there are two separate studies that examine whether or not threat would decrease women's performance in video games, and both found that it did. It's worth noting that in one of these studies that they needed to actively try to inhibit threat to show women's performance increasing because in the control group, women were so aware of stereotypes surrounding them in gaming that they were affected anyway. Now this shows that women can be affected by threat even when there aren't specific environmental cues that activate it. Now that being said, what about Smash tournaments? Do our environments help mitigate effects or do we exacerbate them? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons to believe the latter. One aspect of tournaments that's likely to activate threat has to do with the gender makeup at events themselves. For a comparison, when studying women taking math tests, an area in which women are negatively stereotyped against, studies have shown that the higher proportions of men in a room lead to worse performances for women. This follows a linear path, with women performing better with more women in a room and decreasing the more men you add into it. This is a big problem for Smash tournaments, as the vast majority of competitors are men. For me, I definitely think this played a role in my experiences in Michigan. Like, the tournaments were way bigger there, like I said before, so kind of by default, there were just going to be more men. Also, I mean, I was friends with everyone in Pittsburgh, and I don't know if that actually helped, but I like to think it did. When I lost in Michigan to people who, like, other people told me I was better than, I had it in my head that, like, oh, they were just, like, making better reads or, like, they're smarter than me. And because I had that very static view of the game, it was very easy for me to then go, oh, I'm not as good as these things because of my gender. As it turns out, having a static view of ability can contribute to the effects of stereotype threat. In this way, I think the Smash scene also exacerbates these effects. I've argued this in a previous video, but essentially, having these types of rankings for one skill can lead to a fixed mentality, which then can lead to rage and other mentality issues. For women, these issues may be doubled, as it's not only the issues of having a fixed mentality, it's also how that mentality makes stereotype threat much worse. It's worth pointing out in the original paper that discovered stereotype threat, they activated it by telling black students that the test was a measure of intellectual ability. In Smash, when we do this with a PR, it's essentially the same thing, so threat is likely to be activated. For me in Michigan, a huge problem was that I didn't make PR ever, and I felt awful about it. Whenever I lose to someone that wasn't on the PR, I'd get incredibly upset, and I'd feel like a failure. This led to more stereotype threat because I'd wonder, why am I losing to people not on PR? That doesn't make sense. I, should be better than this, whatever. And then in my head, I'd go, oh, well, maybe I can't do it because I'm a girl. And even though this wasn't true, I mean, when you're salty, it's way easier to believe that type of stuff. And so this made me enjoy the game way less, and it also hindered my growth significantly. It's also worth noting that stereotype threat can affect different people differently. Generally speaking, the more invested in a field you are, the more likely you are to be affected by it. This is a really big deal for Smash because if you're traveling to majors, going to locals every week, and generally doing what you need to do to improve, you're going to feel the effects much worse than people who don't. But the people who don't aren't going to improve. So it's going to affect women's results, and it's going to affect women's results who care. Other studies have shown that in video games specifically, the most affected women are highly competitive and frequent players. So we have this situation where the people in the Smash community, the women in the Smash community, are at a special risk for stereotype threat because they care so much. Similarly, having a high internal locus of control, which is believing that you have control over outcomes in your life, can lead to more negative stereotype threat effects. The reasoning for this is because when you have a high internal locus of control, you're more likely to blame yourself when something goes wrong as opposed to recognize outside factors. So you're not going to recognize that stereotypes about your group are affecting you. For me, I always believed that I could improve, that if I just worked hard, I would get better, even though I never really did. And so when I would think, oh, well, maybe, transitioning is just affecting my brain and I can't do it, I think, well, then I need to find a way to deal with my new brain. And that wasn't even an issue. So I was worrying about this thing and devoting time and energy into thinking about it when it didn't help at all. In retrospect, a lot of this stuff does admittedly seem pretty obvious to me, but it's worth noting that at the time, it was very hard to understand why I was blaming my gender for my performance when that was so unlike me, and also, how that was affecting me on a larger level. That being said, there are things that happen on a much more unconscious level that do affect performance in very significant ways. So, the most obvious example of this is the artwork that's hung up at majors. It's very sexualized, and that in general is bad for performance. One study looked at whether or not showing sexualized advertisements to kids would change their math performance, and they found that it did. It's worth noting this isn't stereotype threat because it affects both boys and girls, and it affects them when they see same-gendered sexualization. So when a girl sees a girl getting sexualized or a boy sees a boy getting sexualized. In general, in our society, this is going to affect women more simply because women are sexualized more in the media, and this is true again at Smash tournaments. There isn't really a lot of sexualization of male characters in the art, but there's a lot of sexualized female characters. I think the last point with this is these things are really hard to detect for anyone, including women. A lot of people do complain about this type of art, but I don't think people really understand the depths of how it affects people. And when you understand this, you have to realize this is an unfair competitive environment. When we put these, types of art up, we are setting up people to perform worse. That is literally unfair. We wouldn't tell women to, have a 30% handicap whenever they start a stock. but yet we have sexualized artwork that can impair how they play. You know, when I would go to a major and I'd see this art, I would get upset at it because in general I think sexualizing characters is bad, and I kind of wouldn't think about it beyond that. I didn't realize that it could affect how I played. I just thought it was like a shitty thing to have. Now, I have heard some people argue that this art isn't actually sexualized because a lot of it is like women in bikinis and that kind of thing, but it's worth noting that in a lot of studies that examine how sexualization affects people, what they're studying is how sexualized advertisements do, and typically those are, videos of women in bikinis trying to sell you something. So obviously in some contexts, like a woman wearing a bikini is totally fine and normal, but at a Smash tournament, it's really not. And it's also worth remembering that it's not like this is, some woman who just decides that she really wants to wear a bikini to a competitive event. This is a man who's drawing a character for the sake of a mostly male audience. So even though it's normal, like, when you're at a beach or something, having drawings of that and having like men look at it and buy it, like that is not okay. And in a competitive environment, it creates a very unfair environment. Kind of in a similar regard, one thing that can also decrease performance for both men and women are appearance-related compliments. So, telling someone they're pretty or handsome or whatever. This is another issue because a lot of women in the past month, with all of the, allegations coming out, one thing that has been said is that women will get hit on a lot at events. And, I know a lot of guys that understand this is wrong and wouldn't do it. And so this is not trying to, like, attack men, but basically, like, every woman that I've seen in the Smash scene has complained about this from time to time. So, it's not just that, like, oh, I mean, if you're blaming yourself for being a girl, you probably won't improve. It's also that there are very, like, common experiences for women to have in the community that will likely take away from their performance. And, it's not like it's their choice or it's their fault for letting this happen. It's the community as a whole's fault for letting events have this environment. So hopefully at this point you agree with me that Stereotype Threat likely does in fact play a role when it comes to Smash tournaments. However, how big of a role does it play? Well, the research has convinced me that it plays a really big one, and to explain why, I'm going to dive into the mechanics of how it works. So now, at this point, I do think it's worth noting that stereotype threat research as a whole has been criticized for overblowing the effects of it. Very frequently, it's presented in a way that's like, oh, well, if stereotype threat didn't exist, maybe we would see, true equality in academics or, all of these other fields. However, there's a lot of, structural racism, structural sexism, all these things that do affect people beyond just stereotype threat. And critics have been quick to point that out. A lot of studies don't have large samples, which can make the data less reliable, and sometimes data that is found isn't found to have a huge effect. Now, when I first heard this criticism, it honestly made me rethink whether I wanted to do this video or not. However, a few things convinced me that this is really important. For one, there are a ton of studies that do show effects of stereotype threat, so even though samples can be low, taken all together, there is a lot of data that does support that this does exist. Also, just because stereotype threat might not account for every aspect of sexism or racism, that doesn't mean it has no effect either. In the Smash community specifically, I think because of how stereotype threat operates, can see larger effects than in most other areas. One of the most commonly cited mechanisms of stereotype threat is increased anxiety. When you are, taking a test or something that you're negatively stereotyped against, you're likely to feel more anxious. It's worth noting that, stress can help people prepare, it kind of gets the body ready to do something difficult. But when you're stressed out about your social identity, you're not focusing on the actual task at hand. Another mechanism of stereotype threat is to reduce people's working memory. Working memory is pretty similar to short-term memory. However, short-term memory focuses on just how many things you can remember in a short period of time, whereas working memory focuses on how many things you can remember while acting on that information. In Smash, adaptation is a perfect example of this. You have to remember an interaction, make a plan for the next time, and then implement that plan all while playing. This is one of the most important aspects of Smash, and Stereotype Threat can impede it. Similarly, Stereotype Threat can cause thought suppression. I've heard two kind of separate ways this can happen. One is that when a negative stereotype enters your mind, you try to block it out completely. And because of this, you end up blocking out other thoughts as you're not allowing yourself to react to situations naturally. The other mechanism I've heard is that when trying to deal with a negative stereotype, you're increasing your cognitive load, so you're not giving yourself enough brain space to think about other stuff. Because of this, you might not remember interactions in Smash as well and not be able to adapt as well. Stereotype Threat has also been shown to reduce women's ability to move on from old strategies that are no longer working and use better new ones. The way this is tested is with a couple math problems where you give people, practice problems, and in those there's like an optimal way to solve it. And then you give them more complicated stuff, and as they do the more complicated ones, they use the old strategies even though they're not as useful anymore. Stereotype Threat has also been shown to prevent people from moving on to new strategies when the old ones stop working at all. So the way you test this is you give people like a game, and you don't give them the rules, they have to figure the rules out. And every 10 or 11 turns, the rules change. And what's found is that people who are under threat take much longer to change from the old rules into the new ones. So people who aren't under threat, men and women, can both, recognize when their old strategies stop working and try to discover new and better ones. Whereas people under threat, specifically women, they struggle to do that and they take much longer to. So taken all together, you can see how Stereotype Threat can seriously impair how people adapt throughout a set in Smash. And that's probably the most talked about and important skill in the game. Every player you fight is going to be different, and so if you can't update your strategies, you're probably just going to lose. For me, when I started transitioning, I actually felt like I was getting better at this, where I'd play and I'd adjust more quickly and I was doing way better. But one thing of note, I was mostly playing on Wi-Fi when I started to transition because I had to work when all my locals were. But when I started going back to locals, I felt like the skill was really impaired. And, to some degree, once again, this is probably in part due to turning nerves that, everyone can feel, right? But there are a lot of aspects of this experience that are unique to women, or at least to people under threat, which happens to be women in the Smash community. So one of the reasons I felt like I was underperforming so much is because I'd go to these big tournaments and I'd expect myself to be able to, understand what an opponent was doing and adapt. And yeah, sometimes they might have been better than me and I might have had bad strategies a lot of times. I know that's true now, but that simple thing was much harder to do for me because of the environment I was in. Now, I hope at this point I've proved to you that Stereotype Threat almost definitely does affect people at Smash tournaments, and that effect is probably pretty important. However, one of the big reasons I was struggling with this stuff is because, I believed that stereotypes were accurate and that my gender was likely a cause of me playing worse. Is there any truth to that at all? Now, there is some truth to stereotypes. If you ask people who do you think performs better in math, men or women, most people are going to say men. And there is some truth to that if you look at measures such as test scores and grades. That being said, people almost always overrate the strength of stereotypes. People expect stereotypes to control for most people's outcomes. So if you're a girl, that's very deterministic for your math skill. However, in reality, the difference between men and women in math is very small. So then, okay, stereotypes in general don't seem to have a lot of accuracy to them, and if they do, there might be other factors. How does that apply to video games? Well, two studies looked at whether men and women accrued skill at the same level. One looked at League of Legends and used League's ranking scale to determine this, and the other study looked at a couple MMOs and used a variety of player skill and time played to discover, how quickly people were leveling up and getting better. What they found is that men and women grow in games at roughly the same rate. There was some differences in gender skill in League of Legends, but this was because men tend to play more. When you account for player time and look at people who play the same amount of time, men and women get better at the same exact rate. If anything, sometimes women can get better even faster than men. So then, okay, I mean, are women just less motivated to play video games? Is our female brains just not enjoying games as much? Well, some researchers do believe this. There's one study on grade schoolers and high schoolers that found that men are more likely to play games often and list higher motivations for playing those games. Now, there's more to this data than you might expect. When analyzing why people enjoy playing World of Warcraft so much, they found that men and women tend to have very similar taste in why they play the game. You know, for example, frequently when women play a game, it's assumed because their boyfriend plays it, or they're just trying to be social, they don't actually care about the game. But when you look at the data, men are just as likely to list socialization as a factor for play as women. And I mean, this makes a lot of sense. I've known a lot of guys, especially in the Smash community, who love going to tournaments specifically to see their friends. This is great for everyone. Researchers also found that gender differences in motivation had more to do with players' age than it did with gender itself. So women are more likely to play when they're in their 20s or 30s, whereas men play from their teenage years and maybe even earlier all throughout their life. Now, just a reminder, the earlier study I mentioned that shows gender differences in interest was on grade schoolers and high schoolers, the age where the most gender differences in video game interest exists. So teenage boys are more likely to list certain things as their motivation, but when you look at women and men of the same age, you find very, very similar interests. So this idea that women just don't enjoy video games and, it doesn't fit the female brain doesn't seem quite accurate, at least for people that, are playing games already. Now, it's worth noting that in the general population, the proportion of gamers that are men is very similar to the proportion that are women. It's 55% are men and 45% are women, or something very close. It might even be closer than that at this point. However, I mean, there clearly are not that many women at Smash tournaments. Why is that? So, the researchers of the study that found similar interest in video games brought up that one of the issues with, getting women into games might have to do with entry points as opposed to genuine interest. Typically, video games are advertised to men, they are played more often by men, so it's harder for women to get in until, they have a partner that gets them involved in it. So when they do get involved, they do really enjoy it. So for Smash, tournaments can seem very unwelcoming for new players, especially women. And, this is probably obvious now that what's happened in the month of July. But even before that, I attended this local once, and I think I was the only woman there. There might have been one other person. But, a mom brought her kid. And the mom pulled me over at one point and was like, "Hey, are you the only girl here?" And so this mom goes, "Oh, well, I brought my son, but he has a sister. And the sister's actually better at Smash than he is. But she didn't want to come because she thought it would be all guys." And so, I know that a lot of the guys in the Smash community will try to be welcoming to everyone, and I mean, I would like to believe that most people aren't going to be weird or creepy. That being said, it's very difficult to know that before you enter a tournament, especially if you don't have the Facebook group for your Smash scene, or the Discord or whatever. Not only that, even if most guys are fine, it's very likely that women at these events are going to experience some forms of sexism, or just feel out of place generally, because being the only person of your gender is really hard. And, I just want to remind you that the point here is not to, attack the Smash community. It's not to attack gaming communities. It's just to point out that, breaking into these male-dominated spaces can be very difficult for women, especially at first. Now, to be honest, if you really believed it, you could probably make an argument using the data we have today to argue that women are slightly worse at video games than men. It wouldn't be as big of an effect as most people would think, but you could still make that argument. However, to do so, I think is just incredibly irresponsible, because there have been so many areas in society that were thought to be male dominated for so long. And as women have broken into these areas, they have succeeded greatly. In school, in general, women outperform men. They attend college more and they graduate more. And this has led some psychologists to ask, well, what do we need to do for our boys to, help them succeed more? And this general train of thought, I, a staunch feminist, agree with. The point isn't to say, like, haha, women are better than men. The point is that very frequently gender differences are assumed because of the things you see right in front of you. But what you see right in front of you probably doesn't mean a whole lot, and it's probably more reflective of the environment you're living in than people's actual abilities. So first I'm going to focus on what women can do to try to deal with this themselves. If you think you've been under stereotype threat, this might apply to you. And at the same time, there are some differences in how threat affects different groups of people. So, try to find whatever works for you. If you think something just doesn't fit your story or whatever, that's probably fine. And just focus on what will help you specifically. After that, I'm going to look at how other people in the community can better themselves to make the environment better overall. And then what kind of like overall the community needs to do as a whole. For women, one of the best things you can do is simply recognize when threat exists and like what situations you think there are negative stereotypes around you. Studies have consistently shown that when you tell women taking a math test, like, hey, just so there are negative stereotypes, they might affect your performance, but, be aware of that. Women do perform just as well as people who don't have any threat activated whatsoever. So recognizing that these things happen is the first step. For me, one thing that I've tried to think of is like, if I'm at a local, then because I'm already like ranked highly and I do well at locals, most people there kind of expect me to do well. And so it's kind of like taking away from the stereotype as like this whole, gamer community thing and just narrowing it down into the people around me. And then, if I have people who do believe I can win when I'm at like a major or something, it also helps because it's like this, there are obviously people who aren't me that do know I can win and they do know that I am good at this game. So that's something that's helped me personally, at least. Also, having supportive communities of women specifically can help. As I said, being around more men can decrease women's performance in these negatively stereotyped areas. So being around more women might help. So, Smash Sisters is probably like the best thing that's ever happened in this regard because it connects women together and it gets them to play each other and just have fun. And it's honestly just a great idea. I think also, try to recognize that any individual tournament doesn't matter a whole lot for like your overall skill or whatever, because at the end of the day we have so many events that one thing is not going to change that much. So, every event, just try to do your best, try to learn from it, and don't view your skill as something that's so static. I know for me, I would try to like, I think as a way to compensate for my insecurities, I would try to like, prove I was better than other people in my head. It's like, oh, how do I know I'm better? And like try to think it out or whatever. And I ended up hurting my friends who, got really annoyed with me. So don't do it for that. But it also really held me back because I was so focused on like where I was at as opposed to just focusing on like, the things I wasn't good at, what I should be practicing, stuff like that. In general, if you put the time in, if you practice a lot, you're going to be fine. If you practice purposefully, if you recognize your weaknesses and try to improve on them, you are going to improve and you will be a good player regardless of your gender. Now for the men in the Smash community, I think one of the biggest things to do is just recognize your own stereotypes that you might have unconsciously and, try to deal with them on your own. I know for myself, I'm not perfect. I obviously stereotype myself. So like just understanding the situations you can do this to other people and trying to work on that is one of the best things you can do. Also, don't check people out at tournaments, sexually. There's a time and a place for that. Maybe. It's definitely not at Smash tournaments. Don't do it. And, if two, like, really close friends or whatever end up dating, that's fine. But that's completely different than, checking out a random stranger. Also, try to be aware that stereotype threat does exist and does matter, and spread awareness when you can, when you get the opportunity. I think one thing that might have helped me in my situation is when I was like freaking out that my hormones just changed me. If someone asked me like, oh well, how do you think Supergirl Cows does it, like that probably would have just made me realize like, oh, I'm being stupid and I should stop. So, just try to support the women in the community the best you can. Um, Try to spread awareness of this stuff and just try to better yourself. You can't like completely eradicate threat on your own, but also we won't be able to deal with this unless everyone in the community understands it and is on board. Now, as a community as a whole, the most obvious thing is just to change the artwork that's available at tournaments. One suggestion I've heard is like only have very, very obviously safe for work stuff, up for sale, and then have like more not safe for work stuff in like binders so that people can still look at it if they're interested. I think this might already kind of be a thing, but I do not think it's been done enough in the Smash community. I still see a lot of very sexualized art all the time. Now, one of the issues with this is that, people can still buy art and walk around with it that is very gratuitous, and that's not great. That might just be something to deal with, but maybe we could have restrictions about, like, don't bring artwork into, like, the tournament area, stuff like that. That could help too. There should be a total ban on pornographic clothing and accessories, specifically like Ahego stuff. That should not be acceptable. I think this is already, kind of going into play with what's happened in July, but just, to give another good reason, it will affect people in this negative way. So let's just not have that there. Let's ban it altogether. So we have to deal with the sexism in our community if we want to move forward from this. One study did show that across different games, there's similar levels of sexism, and it has more to do with people's pre-existing beliefs rather than the effect of the game itself. So in order to deal with sexism in the community, we just have to deal with sexism generally that happens to be in our community. I don't really have a great conclusion for this. I think this kind of just is what it is, and we have to deal with it. And, you know, that's that. The one thing I will say, though, is that after I started identifying as non binary, a lot of these issues became way easier for me to deal with. But it wasn't that, like, suddenly my reads just got way better, and I just, had this magical leap when I changed my identity. The big change was that I stopped blaming myself for things that I couldn't control, and I just focused on learning from each event and improving a little bit at a time. I think one of the biggest lies that stereotype threat can tell us is that if we don't do something well immediately, then it is indicative of who we are as a person. But in reality, no one's going to do well immediately. Like, maybe there are some smash prodigies or whatever, but like, who cares? You don't have to be one of them, and that's fine. I mean, yeah, that's really it. Thank you for watching.